Unit 5, Social Psychology. Presentation 1, Conformity.
In this presentation, we'll be taking a look at a particular form of social influence referred to as conformity. We're said to be conforming when we match our own attitudes or behaviour to that of the majority. Because we are clearly influenced by how the majority think or behave, this form of social influence is sometimes referred to as majority influence. Let's start by looking at one of the classic studies of conformity.
Research into conformity. The most famous study of conformity was carried out in the US by Solomon Asch in the 1950s. Asch believed people wouldn't simply go along with the crowd, so he set up his study to prove that people would stand up against group pressure. What he found was something quite different.
Asch recruited male student volunteers to take part in a study that was supposed to be a test of their vision, although the real aim of this study was to see how individual participants reacted when the majority all gave the same wrong answer on a task. The chances of everyone else giving the same wrong answer are pretty remote, so Asch used Confederates for this purpose. These were other students who were instructed to behave in a certain way at predetermined points during the study. The only real participant was the individual understudy, although clearly he didn't know that.
Each participant was put in a group of 7 Confederates. All the participants were seated around a table. The experimenter then showed the group a series of lines on a board at the front. Each of these standard lines was accompanied by 3 comparison lines. The task of the participants was to state which of the 3 comparison lines was the same length as the standard line. The real participant always answered last or second to last.
This combination of standard line plus 3 comparison lines was repeated 18 times, or, to use psychology speak, on 18 trials. On 12 of these trials, called the critical trials, the Confederates had been instructed to give the same incorrect answer by picking a line that was not the same length as the standard line. The aim of this careful arrangement was to see whether the real participant would respond in the same way as the Confederates, despite it obviously being the wrong answer.
So, did the real participants react as Asch had predicted and stick to their guns? Well, clearly the influence of the unanimous majority had an effect. On about 1/3 of the trials, the real participants went along with the rest of the group, giving the same wrong answer when it was their turn to state their judgment out loud. When participants were allowed to state their judgments without hearing Confederates giving wrong answers, they were correct 99% of the time, which demonstrated that the task itself was a fairly simple one. 75% of participants conformed at least once of the critical trials, with 25% never conforming at all.
Asch was interested in what was causing this conformity. He introduced a number of variations to the study to see which of them would make a difference to the level of conformity of his participants.
Asch first tried altering the size of the majority. He discovered there was very little conformity when the majority was just 2 Confederates, but this rose sharply when there was a majority of 3 unanimous Confederates. Increasing the majority size above 4 didn't really make that much further difference to the conformity level, indicating that size of the majority was significant, but only up to a point.
What made a big difference to conformity levels was when the majority was not unanimous. When the participant was joined by a Confederate who had been instructed to give the correct answers throughout, the level of conformity dropped from 33% to just above 5%. Even when the Confederate gave a different wrong answer to the majority, conformity levels still dropped, this time to 9%. This led Asch to conclude that it was breaking the group's unanimous agreement that was the most significant factor in reducing conformity.
Two British psychologists, Stephen Perrin and Christopher Spencer, tried to replicate Ash's study in the 1980s using students at the University of Sheffield, but didn't get anywhere near the same scale of conformity as Ash. They did eventually manage to get close to Ash's levels of conformity, but only when they made the costs of not conforming appear high to the participants. For example, in one study they used youths on probation as the real participants and probation officers as the unanimous majority. In this part of the study, the levels of conformity were more like those achieved by Ash in the 1950s.
Evaluating research on conformity. We might wonder why Ash had been able to get such high levels of conformity using students in the 1950s, yet Perrin and Spencer struggled to get any conformity using student participants in the 1980s. The answer, suggest Perrin and Spencer, is that in the 1950s, when Ash carried out his study, America was in the grip of McCarthyism. The actions of Senator Joseph McCarthy and his Un-American Activities Committee had created one of the most repressive periods of American history. People were scared to be different, and conformity was highly valued. Because it was rooted in a period of social history where conformity was valued and rebellion viewed with suspicion, Perrin and Spencer regarded Ash's study as a child of its time.
A problem with the use of Confederates in Ash's study is that it would have been difficult for them to behave convincingly and not to give the game away. Two Japanese psychologists, Mori and Arai, tried to overcome this problem. They tested 104 participants in groups of 4 using a technique where participants wore glasses with special polarizing filters. This meant that different participants viewed the same stimuli and yet actually saw them differently. 3 participants in each group wore identical glasses and 1 wore a different set. This had the effect of causing them to see that a different comparison line matched the standard line. The results closely matched those of the original Ash study, although this was only true for females and not for males. This suggests that the Confederates in Ash's study had behaved convincingly.
Ash's study was more a demonstration of independence rather than conformity. An often overlooked fact is that although participants conformed on 1/3 of the critical trials, this means that they remained independent on the remaining 2/3, where the majority unanimously gave the same wrong answer. This suggests that, rather than being overly conformist, human beings are still able to remain independent even when faced by an overwhelming majority.
Not all cultures are as conformist as each other. One way of classifying cultures is in terms of whether they are individualist or collectivist by nature. Individualist cultures, such as the US and the UK, value independence and personal autonomy. Collectivist cultures, such as China and Russia, place greater value on interdependence and group responsibilities. This distinction was supported in a meta-analysis across 17 countries by Peter Smith and Michael Harris Bond. Their study established that collectivist cultures showed significantly higher levels of conformity on Ash-type studies than did individualist cultures.
Smith and Bond also found that levels of conformity have declined since Ash's day, with the date of the study being negatively correlated with the level of conformity found in the study. So, what can we conclude? Research has undoubtedly found that conformity exists, but also that it's dependent on many different factors, including the size of the majority and the degree of agreement within the group. Research also tells us that conformity is not a one-dimensional aspect of human behaviour, but also that it reflects the historical and cultural influences in which a study is carried out.